Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're really excited to be looking at Deviate, the science of seeing differently. A book by Beau Lotto. Have you heard of this
I
one?
have, yeah. And I think it's going to be right up our alley, with the whole idea of how our brains can play tricks on us and how we see the world.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about challenging those assumptions we have about how we see things and how our brains work. And Beau Lotto doesn't just tell us about it, he actually gives us ways to experience these kind of perceptual shifts firsthand, which I think is so cool.
Yeah, totally. It's one thing to read about it, but it's another thing to actually experience it for yourself.
Go ahead.
And that's what makes this book so engaging. So for anyone who isn't familiar with Beau Lotto, he's a neuroscientist who founded something called the Lab of Misfits.
Yeah, the Lab of Misfits.
Such a cool name,
I
right?
love it.
It's this really neat space for exploring perception and creativity.
Yeah, and in Deviate, he really dives deep into this idea that our brains don't actually see reality directly, but rather they kind of build up an interpretation based on our experiences and biases.
It's almost like we're constantly living in a virtual reality,
Yeah.
our own little virtual reality.
Oh, yeah. That's kind of freaky when you think about it.
It is kind of freaky, right? But it's also really fascinating because it makes you realize just how much control our brains have over how we perceive the world.
Yeah, and it's not like a bad thing necessarily, right?
Oh,
This
yeah.
this constructed reality, it helps us navigate the world in a way that's efficient, you know?
For sure. I mean, imagine if we had to process every single detail of our surroundings all the time. It would be totally overwhelming.
Totally. Would be like paralyzed with information overload.
Exactly. So our brains have evolved to kind of streamline things and filter out what's not essential. But the downside is that it also means we're not always seeing things objectively.
Right. Okay. So to really drive this point home, Lotto walks us through a simple experiment in the book. It's called the freezing eye experiment. And this one honestly kind of blew my mind when I first tried it.
Oh, yeah. I'm intrigued.
So let's try it together right now. Okay? Cover one eye and then gently hold the other eye open without moving it. Just focus on a spot in front of you and tell me what happens.
Okay, hold on. One eye covered, holding the other one open. Whoa, okay, things are starting to fade out for me. It's like my vision is getting blurry and kind of disappearing.
Isn't that wild?
It's so weird.
It's because our brains, they crave change and contrast.
Hmm.
So when our eyes are still predazed, the visual information gets kind of boring and our brains just tune it out.
It's like our brain is saying, okay, nothing interesting happening here, moving on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this experiment really shows us just how actively we are creating our own perception. We're not just passive cameras recording what's out there. We're constantly seeking out patterns and differences, to try and make sense of what we see. But here's the thing, that search for meaning often relies on our assumptions.
Which brings us to another key point, that Lotto makes the power of assumptions. He really argues that these assumptions, the ones shaped by our past, our culture, even evolution, they form the bedrock of how we perceive the world. Like they're the foundation upon which we build our understanding of everything.
And sometimes those assumptions, they can really lead us astray.
Oh, for sure.
He used a great example of this in the book. It's the dress phenomenon. Do you
Oh
remember that?
my gosh, the dress. How could I forget that? That was everywhere.
He was like, the internet exploded. Some people saw it as white and gold, right? Others saw it as blue and black. And it turns out the image itself was actually ambiguous. So our individual brains were just filling in the gaps based on our own assumptions about lighting and color.
It just goes to show how subjective our reality can be. Like what we think is objective truth, even something as basic as the color of a dress, it can be totally different depending on the person.
And that leads to a concept that Lotto introduces called our space of possibility. It's fascinating. He's basically saying our assumptions create a sort of mental box, like we're kind of trapped in a room and the walls are our assumptions. And that box limits the ideas and perceptions that are available to us.
So if we want to see more, experience more, we've got to break down those walls,
Yeah.
or at least recognize that they're there, right?
Exactly. But the question is, how do we actually do that?
Well, that's where the story of Dr. Stella Edidevo comes in. Lotto shares this incredibly powerful story about her and the Ebola crisis in Nigeria.
Oh, wow.
So she's faced with this potential outbreak, right? And she makes the really difficult decision to quarantine a patient despite pressure from government officials.
That must have taken so much courage.
It did. And her actions, which were shaped by her medical knowledge and experience, they ended up saving countless lives. Her space of possibility allowed her to see a solution that others couldn't because their assumptions were leading them in a different direction.
It's such a powerful example of how our assumptions can both limit us and liberate us. So how do we break free from those limiting assumptions and kind of expand our own space of possibility? What does Lotto suggest?
He suggests two key strategies embracing play and uncertainty. He says play isn't just about having fun, it's actually a crucial part of learning and adapting. When we play, we naturally confront uncertainty, we experiment, and we step outside those well-worn paths in our brains.
It's like giving our brains a chance to stretch their legs, and explore new territory.
Exactly. He mentions Destin Sandlin from the YouTube show Smarter Every Day as someone who really embodies this playful approach.
Oh, I love Destin.
He's always diving into these hands-on experiments, pushing his own limits, like learning to ride a reverse steering bike. It's pretty inspiring.
That sounds terrifying.
I know, right? But it's that willingness to try new things, to embrace the unknown, that helps him constantly expand his space of possibility.
Okay, so if we want to be more creative, more innovative, we need to tap into that playful spirit a little more.
I think so. And that leads to this really intriguing concept the Lotto calls ecovy. It's the ability to actively choose uncertainty.
Ecovy. I love that word.
Right. So what is it? It's like hitting the pause button on those automatic reactions we have and choosing to look away from the familiar.
Okay, so it's about training ourselves to be more open to new experiences and questioning those ingrained responses.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Lotto shares a personal story about his son, Theo.
Oh.
Theo had this toy, and he was having a really hard time looking away from it, even though it was upsetting him. It's a simple example, right?
Yeah.
But it shows how powerful our attention can be and how important it is to learn to disengage from those knee-jerk reactions.
Oh, I relate to that so much. All those times I've gotten stuck in a mental rut, even when it's causing me stress.
Totally. It happens to all of us. But by cultivating ecovy, we can start to break free from those patterns and open ourselves up to new possibilities.
So how can we start incorporating this idea ecovy into our own lives? What are some practical steps?
That's a great question. And it leads us to this idea of building an ecology of innovation. So this concept of building an ecology of innovation. I think what's so cool about it is that it connects our personal ability to choose uncertainty with creating, spaces and cultures that actually encourage those new perspectives.
So it's not just about changing our individual perceptions. It's about creating an environment where those new perceptions can actually flourish and grow, like planting a seed in fertile ground or something.
That's a great analogy. And to illustrate this, Lotto gives us this really fantastic real-world example. It's Bob Full's Polypetal Lab at UC Berkeley. Have you heard of this one?
I haven't. What is that?
It's this really neat lab that brings together all these different people, biologists, engineers, roboticists, and they study animal movement. And they use those insights to design new technologies.
So they're like getting inspiration from nature to build robots.
Yes, exactly. Pretty cool, right?
That's so cool. I love that.
But what's even more interesting than what they're studying is the lab's culture itself. It's this place where curiosity is really celebrated, collaboration is key, and they actually even embrace this idea of giving up on good ideas to make room for even better ones.
Giving up on good ideas. That sounds kind of counterintuitive. Like, aren't we always taught to hold on to our ideas and, defend them?
Yeah, you would think so, right? But in this ecology of innovation, the focus is really on collective intelligence. It's on building upon each other's ideas to reach something even greater than any one person could achieve on their own.
So it's like that saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go
Yeah,
together.
exactly. And the polypetal lab is a perfect example of how going together can lead to some really incredible results. But it requires this shift in mindset, right? And this ties back to that whole idea of ecovy, but on a larger scale. Because for an ecology of innovation to thrive, there needs to be this shared willingness to embrace uncertainty, be open to new ideas, and even let go of the need to be right all the time, which can be hard for some people.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially in a culture that often values competition over collaboration. It's like we're conditioned to see other people's ideas as threats rather than opportunities.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's why Lotto emphasizes the importance of creating those safe spaces where people feel comfortable taking risks and sharing their ideas without fear of judgment. And he even goes so far as to say that we should be more willing to embrace failure.
Failure, isn't that something we're usually told to avoid at all costs?
It is. But he argues that we should see failure not as an endpoint, but rather as valuable feedback, in the process of innovation. Like it's about learning from our mistakes and using those lessons to iterate and improve. It's all part of the process.
So it's about reframing our perspective on what failure actually means, seeing it as a necessary part of the creative process, not something to be ashamed of.
Exactly. And to create that space where those failures can lead to growth, he emphasizes the importance of fostering a culture of trust and psychological safety.
I think that makes so much sense because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to be willing to take risks or be vulnerable enough to share those half-baked ideas that might actually lead to something amazing.
You're totally right. And this ties back to the story we were discussing earlier about Dr. Stella Adedevo and the Ebola crisis. She was willing to go against the grain to challenge those assumptions that were driving the official response because she had the courage to trust her own judgment.
And her willingness to deviate from the norm ended up saving countless lives. So it's not just about being creative, it's also about having the courage to act on our convictions, even when it's uncomfortable or risky.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes a certain level of confidence and self-belief, and it also requires being able to clearly articulate our ideas and persuade others to see our perspective.
So communication is key too.
Absolutely. Because even the most brilliant idea is useless if we can't communicate it effectively. We have to be able to explain our thinking in a way that's clear, concise, and compelling.
Yeah.
Otherwise, our ideas will just fall flat.
So we need to be good storytellers in a way.
I think that's a great way to put it, because stories have this incredible power to connect with people on an emotional level and make our ideas more memorable and impactful. And that's something that Lotto really emphasizes throughout the book. He uses stories to illustrate these complex concepts and make them more relatable and engaging, which I think is really effective.
It definitely makes the book a more enjoyable read. I mean, who doesn't love a good story, right? But it also helps us understand and remember those key takeaways better.
Yeah.
Because we're not just processing information, we're experiencing it through the lens of someone else's story.
Exactly. And those stories can stay with us long after we finish reading the book. They can inspire us to see the world differently, to challenge our own assumptions, and to take action in our own lives.
So stories are like these little seeds of possibility that can take root and blossom into something really amazing.
I love that. It's like each story we encounter plants a seed in our minds, and those seeds have the potential to grow into new ideas, new perspectives, new ways of being in the world.
And by sharing those stories with others, we can spread those seeds even further.
Exactly. It's like creating a ripple effect of change and innovation. And that's ultimately what Deviate is all about, inspiring us to see the world with fresh eyes, to embrace uncertainty, and to create a better future together.
So how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we actually start putting all of these ideas into practice?
Mm,
So much to think about, right? It can feel a little overwhelming, you know?
yeah.
Like, okay, all these ideas are great, but where do I even begin?
I get it, yeah. But one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that Lotto doesn't just leave us hanging with all these huge abstract concepts. He actually offers some really practical advice on how we can actually start seeing differently in our everyday lives.
Okay, that's good. I was hoping for some actionable takeaways. So what are those tips? I'm ready to shake things up.
Well, one of the things he suggests is to kind of approach the world like an alien. Try to see things with this sense of fresh perspective, almost as if we're encountering them for the first time.
I love that. That's such a cool image. Like hitting the reset button on our perception. But how do we actually do that? I mean, it's not like we can just magically erase all of our past experiences and biases, right?
Right. Well, he points out that travel can be a really powerful tool for this. Because when we're exposed to new cultures and ways of being, it helps us see the world through a different lens. It challenges those assumptions that we didn't even realize we were holding.
That makes total sense. When you're outside of your familiar bubble, you're more likely to notice those things you've been taking for granted. And I think he even mentioned it in research to back this up, right?
He does, yeah. He cites studies that show that people who have lived abroad actually tend to score higher on tests of creative intelligence. So it's like stepping outside of our comfort zone actually helps us break free from those ingrained patterns of thinking.
Wow, that's fascinating. So new experiences, new environments, they shake things up and help us see things with fresh eyes. But what if we can't just, you know, hop on a plane to a foreign country? Are there ways to cultivate that kind of alien perspective in our everyday lives?
Totally. And Lotto emphasizes that these shifts in perspective don't have to be, geographically based.
Yeah.
They can happen anytime we step outside of our comfort zone, whether it's trying a new hobby, taking on a new challenge at work, or even just having a conversation with someone who holds different views than our own.
So it's about actively seeking out those ecotomes, those transitional spaces where innovation is more likely to occur.
Exactly. And he encourages us not just to seek out those ecotomes, but to embrace the discomfort that often comes with them. He even says, we should be more willing to embrace failure.
Failure. But isn't that like the one thing we're always trying to avoid?
I know it seems counterintuitive, right? But Lauder makes this really interesting point. He says we should see failure not as like an end point, but as valuable feedback in the process of innovation. Like it's about learning from our mistakes and using those lessons to iterate and improve.
So it's kind of like that saying, fail fast and fail often. It's about reframing our perspective on what failure actually means and seeing it as an essential part of the creative process.
Exactly. And to create a space where those failures can actually lead to growth, Lotto emphasizes the importance of fostering a culture of trust and psychological safety. And this is where he brings back the example of Nick Evans, the eye surgeon we were talking about earlier, the one who really prioritizes compassion and empathy in his leadership style.
Right. It's about creating that environment where people feel supported and understood
Yeah.
and not, judged or punished for taking risks.
Right. Evans recognizes that people are much more likely to share new ideas, challenge assumptions, and experiment when they feel safe and respected, which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, totally. It's like when you feel safe, you're more willing to be vulnerable and put yourself out there.
Exactly. And that feeling of safety is so crucial for building an ecology of innovation. It's about fostering that culture of trust, where people feel empowered to contribute their unique perspectives and work collaboratively towards a shared goal.
So it's like creating a space where everyone feels like their voice matters and their contributions are valued.
Absolutely. And within that space, it's also essential to be willing to give up on good ideas, like we were discussing earlier with Bob Fole's lab. That idea that sometimes the best way to move forward is to let go of our own cherished ideas and allow others to build upon them.
It's like trusting the collective wisdom of the group you know.
Yeah.
Letting go of the reins a little bit and believing that something even better might emerge when we work together.
Yes, exactly. And that takes a certain level of humility and a willingness to prioritize the collective good over our individual egos.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here today. Ecovies, ecologies of innovation, giving up on good ideas. It's a lot to take in. But what does it all really mean for us? How do we start incorporating these ideas into our everyday lives?
I think it starts with that fundamental recognition that we were talking about earlier. That we don't actually see reality as it is, but rather through the lens of our own assumptions. So if we want to see differently, we have to be willing to question those assumptions, embrace uncertainty, and actively cultivate ecovy in our own lives.
So be more playful, be more curious, more willing to step outside of our comfort zones and try new things, even if it means, risking failure along the way.
Exactly. It's about building those ecologies of innovation, both within ourselves and in the spaces we share with others. And remembering that our perceptions aren't fixed. They're constantly evolving. We have the power to shape our own reality, to see the world anew, and to create a future that's full of possibility.
That's such an inspiring message, and I think it's a perfect note to end on. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Deviate, I'm left with this one thought-provoking question. What assumptions are we holding on to that might be limiting our own space of possibility? What small step can we take today to start seeing differently, to deviate from the expected, and to embrace that transformative power of uncertainty? Keep that question in mind as you go about your day, and who knows what amazing new perceptions might emerge. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time.